On January 24, 1978, Kosmos-954 re-entered the atmosphere and scattered radioactive debris across 124,000 square kilometers of northern Canada. The official explanation: an uncontrolled re-entry caused by technical failure in the satellite's attitude control system. This explanation has two problems. First, the re-entry was not uncontrolled. The trajectory data shows a descent that was corrected 3 times in the final 6 hours. Corrections that require active guidance that a tumbling failed satellite cannot execute. Second, Soviet ground control did not lose the satellite. They destroyed it. The debris field over the Northwest Territories was not the result of a malfunction. It was the result of a decision made 11 hours before impact, when the alternative was a nuclear satellite descending on Toronto with its transmitter active. I found this program through an orbital object monitoring registry I was systematizing for an institutional inventory of Soviet space tracking programs. Kosmos-954 appeared with a notation I had not previously seen in an orbital control database. The final 73 hours of the satellite's flight are flagged as autonomous mode. Command source unidentified. Not loss of signal, not communication failure. Autonomous mode. The satellite was receiving commands, executing them, and the commands were not coming from Moscow. Something was telling the satellite what to do. The satellite was doing it. Nothing personal. An orbital object executing commands from an unidentified source. Unidentified command sources in controlled space assets are what archivists investigate. In those days, every transmission was monitored. Every command signal could be intercepted. There was no way to hide what you were sending into orbit. Today, NordVPN encrypts your internet traffic and keeps your identity hidden from anyone trying to track what you do online. Check the link in the pinned comment for an exclusive deal. Kosmos-954 was a Soviet radar ocean reconnaissance satellite, a RORSAT, equipped with a nuclear reactor to power its radar systems. Its operational profile: low Earth orbit at approximately 260 kilometers altitude, using its reactor-powered radar to track naval vessels for Soviet naval intelligence. Dozens of similar satellites were launched over the program's lifespan. Most functioned, were maneuvered to higher parking orbits at the end of their operational lives, and decayed slowly over centuries. Kosmos-954 did not maneuver to a parking orbit at its operational life's end. It descended. The official Soviet account attributes this to an attitude control failure that prevented the deorbit burn to a parking orbit and allowed natural orbital decay to bring the satellite down. The account is coherent, and the technical failure it describes is plausible. It is also inconsistent with the trajectory record. Natural decay produces a gradual, unguided spiraling descent, whereas Kosmos-954's final 73 hours show a purposeful approach, adjusted 3 times, toward a specific area of North American landmass. The satellite's mission control operator during the anomalous period was senior technician Dmitry Sinitsyn, 31 years old, from the Soviet Space Tracking Center at Yevpatoria. His operational log from the period covers the 73 hours in technical detail, and his personal notes, kept in a separate notebook that he filed with his operational logs, and that ended up in the program file by a chain of archival procedure I cannot reconstruct, document what he was observing in terms that the technical log could not accommodate. His personal notes from January 21, 1978, approximately 50 hours before impact.
January 21st, 1978, 0340 hours. Kosmos-954 is not responding to standard command protocols. Telemetry shows all systems functional. Reactor nominal. Attitude control nominal. Communications nominal. But when I transmit the parking orbit burn sequence, the satellite acknowledges receipt and does not execute. Instead, it executes a different burn, a small one, precise. The orbital parameters shift by 0.03 degrees. Not random, not drift, deliberate. I reported this to the shift supervisor. He told me to repeat the command sequence. I did. Same result. Acknowledgement, different execution. The satellite is listening. It is just not listening to me.
The technician wrote in his private log,
I want to write down what I am seeing, because the technical log requires me to log events, and I cannot log this as an event. The satellite is responding to commands. The commands are producing correct execution. The satellite is maneuvering. Its systems are responding. The telemetry shows a functioning satellite receiving and executing flight directives. The commands are not coming from our stations. I have checked every transmission log, every scheduled command window, every backup communication channel. We are not sending these commands. Another station is not sending these commands. We would see that. The command traffic is appearing in the satellite's execution log as received and processed, but the transmission record at our end shows no corresponding outbound signal. The satellite is receiving instructions that have no transmitter on our side of the exchange. I have been doing this job for 6 years. I know what a communication anomaly looks like. I know what equipment malfunction looks like. This is neither. The satellite is talking to something, and something is talking back, and the conversation is producing a coherent flight plan. I have plotted the trajectory that the executed commands are producing. The trajectory terminates over North America, over the populated part of North America. I'm going to report this to the director. I'm writing it here first because I want it to exist somewhere that is not subject to a decision about what to report.
I want it to exist somewhere that is not subject to a decision about what to report. A technician who understood that what he was observing was going to encounter an institutional decision about how much of it entered the official record, and who documented it privately before that decision was made. The biological transmission that Sinitsyn's observation introduces indirectly, the satellite was doing something in addition to maneuvering, is documented in a separate set of program records maintained by Dr. Galina Volkova, 48 years old, from the Institute of Biophysics in Moscow. She had been attached to the Cosmos Rorsat program, not as a physics specialist, but as a biological effects researcher, a posting that the program's official documentation does not explain. Biological effects researchers are not standard components of naval reconnaissance satellite operations. She was there because the Rorsat program had observed, in previous satellite operations, that the reactor systems produced a secondary emission profile that affected biological systems in ways that the standard radiation monitoring protocols did not capture. Kosmos-954's secondary emission profile, in the final 73 hours before impact, was not the standard reactor emission she had been monitoring. Something had changed. her report filed after the incident. Dr. Volkova's final report contained a section that would never appear in any official documentation. She wrote,
"I want to document the emission anomaly that developed during the final 73 hours of Kosmos-954's operational period, because this anomaly has not been addressed in any of the incident's official documentation, and the omission is significant. The satellite's standard secondary emission profile, the biological range signal that I had been monitoring throughout its operational life, changed approximately 73 hours before impact. The change was not in intensity, it was in structure. The standard profile is noise, complex, irregular, without detectable periodicity. What appeared 73 hours before impact was structured, periodic, organized in a pattern that I can describe mathematically, but cannot account for biologically or physically from any known reactor emission mechanism. The pattern has properties I associate with biological signaling systems. The kind of organized, periodic, information-dense transmission that biological organisms use to coordinate behavior across individuals or within neural systems. I am not saying the reactor was generating a biological signal. I am saying the reactor was generating something that has the structural properties of biological signaling, and that these properties appeared simultaneously with the change in the satellite's command behavior, and that the radius within which the signal was detectable from the ground corresponded to a zone of approximately 340 kilometers around the satellite's ground track, in which animal behavior monitoring stations reported a consistent anomaly, directed movement toward the satellite's position, not panic, not random disruption of normal behavior, directed movement toward the satellite. Whatever the satellite was emitting in its final 73 hours was producing directed movement in biological systems within its reception radius.
Directed movement toward the satellite. Not radiation effects. Radiation disrupts biological systems randomly, produces sickness, kills cells. What Volkova was describing was coordination. Biological systems within 340 kilometers of the satellite's ground track beginning to move toward it, as though the satellite were producing an attractor signal that animal nervous systems were responding to. The director of the Soviet space tracking program called Moscow 14 hours before impact. The telephone record from January 23, 1978 is in the program file.
Director, I am calling to report the current status of Kosmos-954 and to request authorization for an intercept. Moscow status. Director, the satellite is descending under non-Soviet guidance toward North American populated territory. Current trajectory, terminus, the Greater Toronto metropolitan area. Estimated time to entry over urban population, 11 hours. The biological emission is active and has been for 73 hours. Current effective radius, 340 kilometers. Moscow, what is happening in the radius? Director, animal behavioral monitoring in the affected zone shows directed movement toward the satellite's ground track position. Consistent across species, not random. Directed, Moscow, toward the satellite. Director, yes, they are moving toward it. We don't know what happens if the satellite reaches the ground with the emission active. We don't know what happens to the radius when the source is no longer moving. We don't know if the behavior generalizes from animals to humans at higher emission intensity. We have 11 hours. Moscow, can we re-establish command? Director, we have been attempting to override for 61 hours. The satellite executes commands from the other source and ignores ours. We sent a direct termination signal 2 hours ago. Instructed the satellite to shut down all systems. It responded. It was the only response we have received in 61 hours. Moscow, what was the response? Director, the transmitter output increased. It increased by a factor of 3 within 4 minutes of receiving our termination instruction.
The satellite had responded to the termination command, but not by shutting down. By increasing its signal strength, as though it knew what the Soviets were trying to do, and as though it had no intention of stopping. 11 hours remained until impact over Toronto. Moscow responded,
Authorization granted for intercept. Target the re-entry for the Northwest Territories. Low population, Canadian jurisdiction. We accept the diplomatic consequences. Intercept before the satellite crosses below 60 parallel. This conversation did not occur.
The director asked one final question.
Understood. One question for the record. What was it responding to? For 73 hours, something was sending it commands. We don't know what. We don't know if it's still sending them. That question is above this channel. Execute the intercept.
The satellite was intercepted. The re-entry was directed. Hence, the 3 trajectory corrections in the final 6 hours, the corrections that a failing satellite cannot make, toward a dispersal area in the Northwest Territories that minimized population exposure. The debris field was the debris field of a nuclear satellite that was destroyed over northern Canada, because the alternative was a nuclear satellite with an active biological attractor signal landing in Toronto. Operation Morning Light, the Canadian-American cleanup operation that ran through 1978, recovered 65 fragments of Kosmos-954 from the debris field. The operation was extensive, thorough, and well documented. The official cleanup narrative describes it as a radiation safety operation, recovery of radioactive debris to prevent environmental contamination. This is accurate. It is also the component of the operation's mandate that could be publicly described. Here's the first contradiction. The official Soviet account of Kosmos-954's failure describes an attitude control malfunction that produced an uncontrolled deorbit. This account is the basis for the satellite's classification in international space debris records as an accidental re-entry. It is internally coherent and technically plausible. The orbital trajectory data in the program file shows 3 active course corrections in the final 6 hours before atmospheric entry. At T-minus 6 hours, the satellite's descent angle was adjusted by 2.3 degrees, a correction that placed the impact zone in the Northwest Territories rather than the Canadian Prairie Provinces. At T-minus 4 hours, a second correction maintained the trajectory against atmospheric drag variation. At T-minus 90 minutes, a third correction adjusted the fragmentation altitude to maximize debris dispersal over an unpopulated corridor. A satellite in uncontrolled re-entry does not make these corrections. A satellite executing a guided intercept makes exactly these corrections. Both the official account and the trajectory data describe the same satellite in the same re-entry. They describe incompatible re-entries. Here's the second contradiction. The medical records of Operation Morning Light participants, 167 Canadian and American military and scientific personnel who worked in the debris field, are maintained in the Canadian Defence Medical Registry, partially accessible through the program files of cross-references. The official medical summary.
Minor radiation exposure within acceptable parameters for all personnel. No significant health effects.
This assessment is accurate for the parameter it measures: radiation dose. In a classified medical registry maintained separately from the official health assessment, covering 23 of the 167 participants who were referred for follow-up evaluation, is the documentation of a neurological finding that is not in the official summary. All 23 referred participants showed the same symptom: intermittent, involuntary, spatial orientation toward the location of the debris field they had worked in. Not toward any landmark, not toward north, not toward home, toward the specific geographic location where Kosmos-954's debris was dispersed. The orientation was involuntary and precise. Medical evaluators tested it. The participants could not suppress it and could not explain it, but when asked to indicate the direction of the debris field without visual reference, they pointed to it with an accuracy that the evaluators characterized as inconsistent with any known navigational capacity. Standard radiation exposure does not produce a specific directional orientation toward the radiation source. The 23 participants had been in the debris field. The debris field had been producing a biological attractor signal for 73 hours before it hit the ground. The signal's range was 340 kilometers. The cleanup workers had been inside 340 meters. Here is the third contradiction, the document that should not exist. The satellite's operational command log, the record of commands sent to Kosmos-954 and its responses, contains 61 hours of commands from the unidentified source that Sinitsyn documented. It also contains one command from the Soviet ground station, sent 2 hours before the intercept authorization, a termination instruction ordering the satellite to cease all active systems, and one response: the transmission output increase Sinitsyn's director reported to Moscow. A factor of 3 increase in 4 minutes. This response is in the command log as a received and executed command. The satellite logged the termination instruction as received, and its execution record shows the transmitter power increase as the instruction's output. The satellite did not interpret the termination instruction as a command to stop. It interpreted it as a command to intensify. Either the satellite's command interpretation system had been altered by the 73 hours of external guidance to produce this behavior, or the external source that was guiding the satellite had anticipated the termination instruction and pre-programmed the response. The command log cannot distinguish between these interpretations. Both require that something with access to the satellite's command architecture had modified it, and that the modification was stable enough to override a direct termination order from the satellite's operators. The orbital registry that led me to this file catalogs the debris of Kosmos-954 in standard format. 87 fragments identified by observation, 65 recovered during Operation Morning Light, a discrepancy of 22 fragments. The registry notation: acceptable variance given terrain conditions in the recovery zone. I located the topographical maps of the Operation Morning Light recovery area. The terrain is flat tundra, the lowest relief landscape type in the Canadian North. There are no terrain conditions in a flat tundra that account for losing 22 fragments of a nuclear satellite. The fragments were not lost to terrain. I found a Canadian Geological Survey record from 1979, 1 year after the incident, documenting 22 localized magnetic anomalies in the debris field area. I overlaid the anomaly map on the morning light recovery map. Each anomaly corresponds to a position where one of the 22 missing fragments should have been. The fragments are at those positions. They are below the surface. The 1979 survey estimated their depth at approximately 3 to 4 meters below the surface, below the tundra, in permafrost that should not have permitted them to sink. Permafrost is, by definition, frozen solid. Objects dropped on permafrost do not sink into it. I searched for subsequent geological survey records for the same locations. I found one from 1983, 5 years after the incident. The same 22 magnetic anomalies, resurveyed. Estimated depth, 7 to 9 meters. The fragments had moved downward through frozen ground by approximately 4 meters in 5 years. The 22 missing fragments of Kosmos-954 are in the permafrost of the Northwest Territories, moving downward through frozen ground at a rate of approximately 0.8 meters per year. They are currently, by extrapolation, approximately 38 meters below the surface. They have been moving downward for 46 years. I am going to close this file. I am going to note the orbital registry cross-reference as reviewed. I am going to log my access. I spent some time with the question of what the command source was. The file does not answer it. The Moscow duty officer declined to answer it on the channel it was asked, which means either he did not know or the answer exists at a classification level above the channel. Above the channel used to authorize a nuclear intercept over Canadian territory, which suggests the classification tier is very high indeed. What I can determine from the available record, the command source was not Soviet, not American, not any identified ground-based tracking station. The commands were precise, consistent with knowledge of the satellite's systems at an engineering level, and produced a coherent flight plan that would have terminated in a major North American city if not intercepted. The source knew the satellite's architecture. The source knew where it was going. The source, when given a termination instruction, chose to interpret it as a command to increase power. I thought Kosmos-954 malfunctioned and fell. I was wrong about the sequence and the agency. The satellite did not malfunction and then fall. The satellite was reached. Something reached its command architecture, modified it, and directed it toward a populated landmass with its transmitter at increasing power. The re-entry was a destination, not a failure. Something wanted the satellite on the ground. The intercept prevented that destination from being a city of 3 million people. What wanted it on the ground is the question the Moscow duty officer refused to answer on the channel it was asked. Whatever was sending commands to Kosmos-954 for 73 hours, producing directed movement in biological systems within 340 kilometers, interpreting a termination instruction as a command to intensify, that source is not in this file. The file documents what the satellite did and what was done to it. It does not document what was directing it or whether it is still directing anything. 22 fragments are moving through permafrost. They have been moving for 46 years. I do not know what they are moving toward. I am closing the folder. End of file.